So welcome back to the show. How you doing?
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm well. Yeah, it's life is happening.
That's right. Well, you have an incredible new album out called Being Somewhere, and it continues a trend of each album sounding very different from the last. Now, some bands they'll make a career of sticking to a sound, and others like to continually explore new sounds. So why do you think you fall into the latter group?
I don't know if it's like boredom. As soon as I've sort of done something, I immediately feel like I need to move on. Maybe boredom's kind of like too negative a word to apply to it, but I get fidgety. I always feel like I want to be trying new things, expanding my horizons. And I guess I also feel like the best of me is yet to come. And maybe that's a very optimistic way of looking at it. But I always feel like there's just some special new sound around the corner that I'm just scratching the surface of or something like that. And I've also had the pleasure and the luxury of working with some amazing people, some incredibly talented folks. And I love that collaboration. I like to see what other people can kind of pull out of my songs that I've written.
Hmm. Now, when I think of a band that likes to explore new sounds, Radiohead is one of the bands that I think of. And you actually, for this album, you worked with somebody who has worked with them, correct?
Yeah, I mean, mind-blowingly. They are without a doubt my favorite band in the world, hands down. And Drew Brown, who produced this record, has worked with them. He was Nigel Godrich's kind of right hand in London for a number of years, and so he worked with Radiohead and Beck and Paul McCartney. He has keys to the castle in a sense, and has worked with the very best. And so, at the beginning of our relationship, there was a fair amount of imposter syndrome. Like he was going to sniff me out and realize that I was this very uncool Canadian, songwriting dude. Um, but he just from the get go, he heard something in my songs. And I think what I've learned from working with Drew is that, here's someone who's worked with the quote unquote coolest bands in the world. And the way he speaks about those bands and those individuals is that they don't give they don't care at all about being cool, and that's maybe part of what makes them cool.
Hmm.
And they just are curious, creative, interested people who are you know uh, kind and warm-hearted, and so I think that that's a bit of like a beacon of hope, for the rest of us, that focus on the work, focus on trying to keep that curiosity and trying to always get better. That's the other thing. Like I'm 39, but I feel like I'm writing the best songs of my whole life. And, I feel a certain amount of certainty or sort of strength uh, in my songwriting and my lyrics. And Drew, he feels that same gut instinct certainty when it comes to sonic textures and sound and sound production. So in a way, this record being made long distance, between Vancouver and Chicago and LA and New York and London, et cetera, Drew was kind of helming the project. And I love that he applied, the same sort of ambition to the sonics as I did to the actual melodies and the lyrics.
Right. Now, you mentioned recording this and working long distance. And that's interesting to me. Jill Barber and Slow Leaves, they just released a single that they wrote and recorded virtually, never having
Mm.
met in person. It's a function of the pandemic. A lot of people had to adjust to doing things virtually. And it got me wondering, how did you have to adjust for the writing for this album and the recording of it?
Yeah, so I would record the vocals and the guitar in my basement, and Drew and we'd go back and forth. I'd send him voice memos, and here's a song. The interesting thing with Drew is that he doesn't want like a fully fleshed out demo. He wants the least amount of information possible. He wants he wants the vocal melody, and underneath it, a very, very small amount of, chord tonal texture or something like that on which that melody can sit. And so anytime I tried to send him something that was like an idea that was fully formed, he was like, no, 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 no. Just give me the least amount of information possible. so that, when we get into recording, we can start throwing things at the wall and seeing what happens. But he doesn't like to prescribe or have like a really strong target. He likes to have a very vague target in mind, because I think that then what happens is that you get into it, you get really deep in the trenches with your song, and you don't know what you're going to uncover. You kind of stay in discovery mode, and that's the most exciting place to be. Like, you ask any musician, like, what was the most exciting song to record, and they're going to tell you it was one of the songs that surprised them. That
Mm.
like they went into the studio thinking it was going to be one thing, and it came out totally differently. Because if you have this idea in mind of what you're looking for, and it's very precise, you will never exactly hit it, and you will always feel like you've come short. Whereas if you clean your mind of such contraptions, and sort of cages, then you end up somewhere cool. No matter where you end up, it's like, oh, that was interesting.
Yeah. Is it hard for you to have this idea, which obviously you think is good because you formed it and send it in and have someone say, no, 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 I don't want that much. Like, is that hard for you to let go?
Completely. Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I'm a bit of a control freak. And there were times, where Drew would send me back something that he had worked on the song, and I'd be like, no, you killed my baby. He took it in some crazy direction or whatever. Um, but by and large, you know, Drew would say, sit with it for 48 hours, listen to it like 20 times, get used to it, and then call me back. And so I would do that. A couple of days later, I'd call him back and I'd be like, you're a friggin' genius. And I think that this album, like I said, this album to my team, my management and everything, and they were like, at first, they were not sure of it. They were like, well, it would be nice if there was a troubled mind on here that we could send to the radio that was an obvious sort of like, rock jam. Um, and I think it took them like a couple of days. So I keep saying that to people, like, it's a grower, like you need to give it a second. But if you let it sink in, it will sink its teeth into you. And eventually you will find yourself humming a myriad of hooks, because I think that at first it can kind of sound a little bit random or a little bit chaotic. And then after a few listens, the songs start to formalize in your mind, and it then becomes just like an onslaught of very meticulously placed, melodic hooks.
So that's interesting because on the first listen, I loved it. And maybe I'm not looking for something that's going to be a commercial radio hit or,
Sure.
whatever, just because of my background and what I do. But back in March, you actually sent me a link to listen to the album in advance and asked what I would recommend as singles. And I remember, suggesting, well, if for CBC, you'd probably want this, but for me, these are the ones that I would like. So I'm assuming you reached out to a bunch of people in the industry. And I'm curious as to whether you noticed a difference between the answers you got from more commercial outlets versus what you got from campus community folks like me.
Completely. Completely. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally different. But what was cool? So I sent I sent like a private link to this record out just to a handful of people who were like, DJs or, journalists, people who were kind of in the industry but didn't like work like people who worked on the sort of receiving end of music rather than on the like pitching end of music. And I was curious, like what strikes you. And one thing that was really cool is that from that span of people, literally every song was mentioned by somebody as a
That's
potential
great.
single. And I was like, that's amazing. Like that's
That's got to feel
promising, right?
good. Yeah.
Yeah, because it meant that there was no filler, Every song was sort of like this secret, underhanded banger, in a weird, sad way, I sent it to a friend in a band, and she wrote back that "In Your Corner" should be the single, and that's like the softest, quietest song on the whole record. And I was like, that's amazing. But I mean, everyone has their own interpretations of and their own motivations, right? Like, you send
Yeah.
it to the label, they're like, well, we need to sell this. So, okay, what is the most sellable thing? But I honestly think that, what is a single anymore? Like, is it the song that does well on Spotify, or is it the song that does well on radio? It might not be the same song, like, Troubled Mind on the last record, it got to, I think, like number 4 on the charts or something like that. And it was the highest we'd ever gotten on Canadian radio, commercial radio. Um, but if you look on Spotify, I don't even think it's in the top five. Like it was Fool for Waiting that did well on Spotify, and that would never get played on the radio. So I think that Spotify has sort of changed the way that we can perceive what a single is anymore. And
Right.
now it's just like, what has a sonic texture that will grab people in 4 seconds,
Yeah. Kind of feels like what can you place in a movie so you make the most money, and that's going to be your biggest single, unfortunately.
or
So
or a TikTok. Yeah.
yeah. So I'm a big fan of the band Frightened Rabbit, and on this album you pay tribute to their late singer Scott Hutchinson, and I was just curious as to why.
Oh man. Well, he was such a poet, such a kind of kind-hearted, sweet dude. I didn't know him that well, but I had many mutual friends. Um, and his passing just completely gutted me, that he was this sort of like beacon of joy and understanding for so many listeners, but he couldn't feel it himself. He was so fettered. So, he was very vocal about uh, his kind of issues with mental health, and um, he wrote a song called "The Woodpile" that you must know. Will you come back to my corner? Spent too long alone tonight. And I just thought it was such a beautiful sentiment. Come back to my corner. I've spent too long alone tonight. Um, and so I wrote this song sort of as a response, and it came very quickly in the days after he passed. I remember literally, there's a line in the song, "Crying in the shower." I was literally like crying in the shower, just total mess. And I mean, it sounds almost kind of trite to say, considering the severity of, mental illness, but I wish that the words of this song I could have said to him, if I had had the chance.
Right.
Um, and so, the song lives as it's dedicated to Scott, but, as it lives and breathes now, it can be for all of us, for any of
Hmm.
us, in the midst of the down swoop. I think that we all fluctuate, between our sort of strong, you know, capable mind and our sort of fragile, um, flummoxed self, and I think that in those down swoops, in the periods where you're sort of facing the harder points, words like this song could maybe be of help, and that's all. That's all I ever wanted with songs, is to sort of feel connected to other human beings in this weird kind of cosmic
Yeah.
way, you know.
Yeah. Well, great art can have great appeal. So I get that. Um, so speaking of connecting with people, it sort of leads me to another venture you have called Side Door. So for those who are unfamiliar, can you explain what it is and how you're involved?
Totally. So Sidor is an arts marketplace, where any space is a venue. You could kind of look at it like Airbnb for shows. So living rooms, backyards, bookstores, warehouses, you name it. And hosts and artists connect in the app, and they build shows together. They can ticket those shows. You can create unique revenue splits, and both parties kind of get paid out automatically. They're cut after the show. So it's this very like friendly, transparent sort of attempt to democratize and decentralize the live entertainment industry so that we can have a large swath of middle class musicians where artists can make a living doing what they love, whether or not they're famous. That's the intention. That's what we're trying to build. And so I'm a co-founder with my friend Laura. We started in 2017. And today, there's about 3,000 spaces in North America and about 6,000 artists on there now. And we've been through you know, the grinder of the pandemic and doing online shows. Now we're back to doing just
Hmm.
in-person shows. We recently were on Dragon's Den. We scored a deal with Arlene Dickinson, which was kind of fun,
I saw that.
and it was pretty nerve-wracking, but
They
exciting.
waited right till the end, right?
I know, yeah, she was the last one.
Yeah.
She offered us the deal. It was great. But it's just not something that I ever really expected was going to be in my life, was, being involved in a tech company like that. Sorry, I'm yawning. But it's been a really rewarding and amazing experience. And it's also very hard. Trying to build this thing with a mission, this purpose to sort of serve artists. And meanwhile, we're, getting investors, which means there has to be like a profitable business model. And it's a crazy thing to try and muster, but
Love that.
exciting.
You're diversifying your musical portfolio, really. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and it's amazing how many parallels there are, between building a fan base, although I've never really loved the word fan, but building a supporter listener base, let's call it, and building a user base on Side Door. There's along the way, I've noticed many similar things of like, it's all just about trying to foster a community and trying to give that community something that creates some sort of existential respite.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. Well, what kind of similarities do you see between what Side Door and what campus community radio do?
Well, I think that, at the heart of it, community, right? Like I remember when I was at UBC and I used to go eat lunches at the CITR, you know, lunchroom or, I just wanted to be around there. There was like this energy coming from that radio station. It was full of life and, that's where like Nardwar had his show. And
Right.
um, so, I think in terms of like developing a scene, you need these hubs, you need these sort of play, and they're not always going to be in bars. That's one of the problems is that bars and like so much of live music happens in bars in and around the sale of alcohol. And it's the sale of alcohol which keeps those venues alive. And that is a system that works by and large, but it's not the only system. And to have dedicated people who are doing things for the sake of doing them. I mean, most of our hosts, especially the residential hosts on Side Door, they don't um, they don't take any money. Even though they could, they want it all to go to the art. They're hosting for the experience of being a curator for their friends and family and community, and for bringing art to where they live. And they're doing it for the purpose of being involved in the cultural experience and to try and help art thrive. And really, I mean, I can't imagine you getting paid much money to run your show on a campus, community radio station,
Zero.
which
Yeah.
which makes it more important. It's like it makes it gratuitous. Like, I love Banksy has a quote about how the fine art world scoffs at graffiti as being the lowest art form, but he's like, I look at it the other way. You don't get paid to do graffiti, which means that it is the only true art form. Like it is for its own sake. It is completely gratuitous. It is for
Right.
the sake of doing it. That is the art. And I love that. So I think, I get excited about anybody who's willing to put time and effort into something that doesn't make sense on a balance sheet. And I
Yes.
think that I think that so much of the community on Side Door is, there's artists trying to make a living, and there are people who are trying to make art thrive. And you know, you there are artists making music, and you are helping art thrive by having your show on this station. And if there was nobody who wanted to host shows on the station wouldn't exist. So, kudos and thank you, for being you're like a Sherpa that helps artists get up the mountain.
I like that. I do think there's a lot of overlap. I think a lot of the artists who can take advantage of Side Door are artists that get played on stations like ours. I think a lot of the people who want to host shows through Side Door are the people who listen to and appreciate campus community radio because they want that connection, that experience. So I would be remiss if I didn't get your perspective on what campus community radio has meant to you, particularly at the start of your career when
Oh
you were trying to
man,
establish yourself.
totally. Well, like the first dozen radio appearances that I did before I had any, foray into the commercial radio world were all on campus stations. Um, I, yeah, man, in those early days, particularly, I mean, think about it this way, like there is a very small bandwidth on commercial radio for what they can play. They have to appease advertisers. They need market share. They need to play pop music so that, they can kind of capture the masses. There is a mandate on commercial radio that is about, it's a profitable model. It's like it's about creating business, and there's a huge monopoly of Clear Channel across North America owning most of the stations, and those playlists are getting more and more stringent, and DJs have less and less control over what they're playing.
Yeah.
And so bands that are just emerging, bands that are just getting going, like it is too big of a risk for those huge stations to play those acts because they're not proven. They're not proven in the market yet. We
Yeah.
don't know what demographic and target market there is for those acts yet because they're brand new and they're just figuring it out. And so that's where campus and community stations come into play is they have the ability to take risks. They have the ability to try new things. And at the heart of it, people like yourselves have control over what they play. So,
Exactly.
it's not coming from sort of, it's like the playlist isn't coming from the cloud,
No.
like it's not being centralized from, one person in New York who's controlling the playlist for the whole North America. So, you have a real opportunity to be a player. And I remember in those early days, like when somebody would get behind, there was a DJ on CITR named Val. There was various ones across Canada who would get behind my music and play it. And, they were those early champions that sort of allowed me to have a spark that I could then fan into a flame. And you need those sparks. And if you're not getting those sparks, it's really tough.
Yeah. I remember when Road Regrets came out, I wore that out on the radio, just wore it out.
Amazing.
So, yeah.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
So you're heading out on tour recently, or soon, I think, to Europe. Now, Cadence Weapon just recently wrote about how touring is not financially viable for a lot of artists. So as you get ready to head out on tour, what constitutes a successful tour for you?
Yeah, it was a great piece by Rolly. Um, I mean, it is really tough. Gas is crazy expensive. Accommodations are expensive. Everything's expensive. And at the same time that the cost has gotten out of hand, um, it's become harder to sell tickets because people are strapped financially. There's also so much competition for their attention and their dollars. There's a lot of like huge legacy acts out there kind of sweeping up, cleaning up all of the money. Um, it's really tough, looking at this Europe tour, like it's completely possible that I will lose money and spend a month of my life in Europe, and it's rough, it's risky, it's dangerous in many ways, and more important than ever before, that if you have a love of, those sort of club bands, not the ones in the arenas, but the ones in the clubs, you know, you gotta buy tickets and go to their show because if people don't, they might not come back to your town, maybe ever. And there's a lot of artists right now who are wondering, how they can make a life in music without having to tour. And it's not the death of touring yet, but it is it's a grim picture out there.
Yeah.
And I have always been very ambitious and hungry, and I've never been averse to taking risks. And so that's just how it's been in my career. I've always sort of been willing to take the risk and go for it. Um, and so that's what I'm doing now, same as ever. I don't feel like I'm done. I don't want to scrape the barrel of what I've built. I want to keep building and growing that barrel. So, you know, I'm gonna I'm gonna go for it. But yeah, there are moments of panic along the way.
I can imagine. Now, I've seen some stuff in the news recently about bands not wanting to play their old hits, while others are performing to always they're promising to always perform them live. So where do you stand on that? Is Robots out or
No, Robots is in. Robots was out for a little bit, but it came back around. It's fun. And now it's old enough. It feels nostalgically enjoyable. You know what I mean?
nice?
Like it was part of the zeitgeist for a moment, and then it became almost like I felt like the spectacle had outgrown the song, And there were moments when I was on stage and I didn't feel like I was in a gregarious mood, but I felt like I kind of had to put on a big stunt around that song. And those moments didn't feel very genuine. And so
Right.
I stopped playing that song for a little while. But then there was a moment, Peterborough Folk Festival years ago, where everything was running late and they had to turn off the PA because they didn't want to get fined. But our set was cut off early. We were closing. And so we went out in the field and we did robots campfire style, where instead of getting everyone to sing the ending, we got them to sing the whole song. And that was a transition for me because I was like, oh, people are just waiting for the ending to sing along. And if I just invite them to sing the whole thing, it's less about me performing the song and it's more about this communal event of let's all sing the song together. And truthfully, like I feel like I don't own it anymore. You know what I mean? Like it's sort of gone beyond me.
Right.
It's now this sort of like, you know, I see people with kids on their shoulders who loved that song when they were in college, you know, and now their kid is singing it. It's
Yeah.
like there's like this nostalgic sort of thing
Yeah.
to it. Um, I think you got to play the hits because as much as sometimes I'm like, oh, I don't want to play that song, you know, when I go to a concert, like I want to hear the hits,
Yeah.
you know, I when I went to I went to bought one of the a Bon Iver concert, years ago at the Forum here at Peony, and if he didn't play Skinny Love, I was gonna be pissed,
Yeah. Yeah.
or at least a handful of songs from that first record.
Right.
Um, and I try and approach the stage like you know, these folks, they have gotten babysitters or whatever, they've driven, they've taken the train, they've paid for a ticket, they're giving me a night of their life,
Mhm.
and they're trusting me with it, and I want them to have a good time. So, I will. I think on this next tour, we're playing a bunch of the new record. We're playing about 7 of the 9 songs, but a lot of those songs are quite short. And we're going to be playing a lot, Road Regrets and Robots and Basket, probably Indie Queens and Post-War Blues, and um, I can't remember what else was on that set list. But it's a good mix of the old bangers and a whole bunch of new stuff.
Well, I know that everybody who was at that Peterborough show probably had one of their best experiences at a concert ever. Like that's the kind of thing that can make live music really special. And again, it goes back to
Hmm.
community, right? You had a sense of community, and I just think that's
Totally.
so important in music,
And
right? So
when I serve tables, I noticed that if everything went perfectly fine, you get a 15% tip. And if something went terribly wrong and you fixed it and blew their mind with what a great fixer you were, you'd get a 25% tip. And I think about that a lot, like,
yeah,
you make the most of the moment. We got rained out of a show in Burlington once with Donovan Woods and the Strumbellas, and so we went out into the parking lot and played in the parking lot after the rain stopped when everyone was leaving. The concert was canceled, and people loved it. It
oh
was,
yeah,
and I think about that all the time. Like, there's always a silver lining. If something goes wrong, you can figure it out. You can make it right. You can do something interesting. You can save the day, and often going that extra mile will leave an impression in people's minds. That is often greater than if everything had gone perfectly well.
yeah, exactly. Listen, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat before you head out on tour. Good luck with the tour. Your new album is incredible. It's my favorite album by you, and I don't say that to toot your horn. I honestly mean that. So we
Oh,
played
thank you
Fire
so much.
Escape right before the interview. So what song would you like us to go out on?
I really appreciate that, Ryan. Thank you so much. I do. I'm 39 years old. I feel like this is the best record I've ever made. It feels good to feel like the best of me is happening and yet to come.
For sure.
Um, Thank you for your support. I think maybe Just Know It is a nice sort of
Just know it.
short
Perfect.
pop, moody one to end on.
Love it. All right. So here's some Dan Mangan on CKCU.